Hear from me and my guests as we share our stories of perseverance. My name is Tamara, and I'm the host of Without Regret, the podcast.
We want fair treatment. We want to be psychologically safe in the workplace.
All forms of bullying and abuse can do significant neurological scarring to the brain.
A journalism career I had built for more than 30 years after rising to the top of my profession, all of it was taken away from me.
While I was waiting for resolve, they were waiting for me to snap.
Section 5A1 of the OSH Act of 1970 requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm.
Welcome to another eye-opening episode of Without Regret, the podcast. As a seasoned HR chief, this week's guest has navigated the intricate landscape of workplace abuses from both ends of the spectrum. Picture this: filing complaints against her own boss and even the chief executive, all while her board hesitated to address decades of bullying and harassment. On the flip side, she spearheaded numerous internal investigations across diverse environments. In this episode, I bring you insights from both sides of the table, demystifying the often perplexing process for employees. We'll shine a light on those behind-the-scenes conversations between HR and the upper echelons of an organization. But here's the twist. Kimberly is not here to offer the conventional advice of seeking another job or resorting to coping mechanisms for the trauma of workplace abuses. Instead, she's here to empower you. She shares practical strategies on how to advocate for yourself and to build direct evidence that can bolster a formal complaint or even a legal claim. And for her fellow HR professionals trying to instigate change in an organization where the boss isn't on board, Kimberly's got your back too, offering guidance on managing up effectively. Get ready for an episode that redefines the narrative. This is Without Regret, where we equip you to stand up, speak out, and reclaim your power in the workplace. Well, thank you so much for joining. I was actually just watching this video that's on the website that you linked in your email. Yeah, so very interesting. I didn't get all the way through it, but yeah, very interesting. Do you want to start there, or do you want to kind of start with your history?
Yeah, either one would be okay.
Let's just spend a little bit talking about your history and like where you come from.
Absolutely. So I kind of took a long and windy road to land in HR. I actually started my career as a U.S. history professor.
Oh, okay.
And so I spent 7 years teaching 18 and 19-year-olds. And I don't know if you know any, but they're not very nice people. So in a way, they're kind of like good practice because they're not going to politely nod along when you're boring them. They give you a lot of instant feedback. And so for me, it was like this exciting thing that kind of paid off throughout my career because I learned how to tell stories. I learned how to be engaging with a tough audience. And I look back at that with a lot of fondness and appreciation for them for doing that. And then I left there and went to work at the State Department with the anticipation that I'd be doing the same things, that I would be doing cultural and educational programming, that I'd be lecturing. And I started out doing that, but early in my tenure, I was assigned to a management officer position. And at first I freaked out. I was like, you can't do this to me. I'm a liberal arts major. Like, what's happening? And it was in HR. And it ended up being the most rewarding thing I had ever done in my entire life. And I went from lecturing sometimes with like 1,000 or 2,000 people where you can't really have an emotional connection with those you're kind of talking at someone, to these one-on-one experiences where I was there on the best day of people's lives when I'm getting to tell them that congratulations, you and your family are moving to Paris or London. And then also the same person to take calls when my child has brain cancer and I'm terrified of losing my job and insurance. And so there was just so much meaning, like deep and profound meaning, that I loved it. And I left my kind of old life and never went back, and kind of have been with HR ever since, which has been, well over a decade now, probably coming up on like 14 years. And so, but I kind of carried that old thread of communication, of telling the stories of people, and trying to use words to solve a lot of the complicated, messy problems that people can find themselves in.
So working for the State Department in HR. So I wonder if that's different than working for corporate America. Have you worked for corporate America?
Yeah, so I do now.
Okay.
And what a pleasure. You know, when you come from the public sector, the bureaucracy, the red tape, you
Okay.
know, yeah, I mean, even in one county I worked with just trying to get new forms introduced. I remember working with a young lady on my team who got pregnant, you know, had her baby, came back from maternity leave, and we had still not moved anything forward. And I was like, oh my God, we can create human life in less time than we can move through the bureaucracy. Because even to make tiny changes, you know, you had to get all the unions to buy in. There was like a separate civil court process, and then you had to get board approval. I mean, it was just crazy. Whereas in corporate America, you're like, I want to change this. And like, okay. And you're like, oh my God, you know, how amazing is that? So it's much,
Right.
much better. Yeah.
Okay. I guess that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like, I feel like it's when you ask Google a question and it gives you answers you weren't even thinking about, like, but you see, oh, I understand how that, yeah, let me rephrase this. So I feel like that's what just happened. Your Google. Um, I guess I was coming from more of a compassion
I hear you on that. Yeah.
side, because you said that it was rewarding for you and you enjoyed the one-on-one and you enjoyed telling people and helping people and all that stuff. And I guess, I don't know, I think I have a different experience with HR people.
Oh,
I
a lot
don't
of people
have
do. Yeah.
yeah. So I kind of think of them as the enemy a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so
That's
that's
a
why I
well-deserved
was,
reputation. I completely agree with that assessment.
yeah.
Speaking. Yeah. And you're right. In the public sector environment, you're far more protected for sure. There's a million more protections. But what I have found is it doesn't protect you from abuse. You know, you still have massive egos that, you know, because at the end of the day in public sector, you funnel up in the top of your organization's elected officials. And so they have their own set of motivations, their own set of demands. They're not held accountable in ways you might have in the private sector. So you know, even powerful CEOs we've seen since Me Too can be knocked out of their seats with bad publicity. And much harder to move an elected official out. You have to wait till the next election, and then that still, you know, they still may stay around forever.
Good
And
point.
so, yeah, so it can definitely vary. And I do hear you on your point about private sector being far more transactional. You're an at-will employee, you know, so there's a lot of opportunity for abuse in environments like that. And HR does play a very critical role in how that's shaped. And so I think it's really important, you know, for the HR person to come in saying, this is who I am, these are my values, this is how I operate, and make that known, you know, to the very top of an organization who they will report up to, and make sure that, you know, when I'm seeking out opportunities, I'm at the company I'm at because I know we've got a chief executive who has great integrity. And when I tell him we have a problem or we've got a bully or there's some abuse, he has my back. So I can go in there and address it immediately. But I know that's not always the case. So.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I guess I've always felt that HR is working for them, not for me. You know, to
You're
protect
right.
me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in the sense that HR reports up.
Yeah.
And so, and you can tell a lot about what a CEO thinks based on how HR looks.
Mm,
If they value people and they value the function, they will hire for that. If they don't, they might get, you know, the person who plans the birthday parties and, you know, kind of moves the paperwork, but they're not very empowered.
mhm.
And so you end up with two kinds of people. You end up with the integrity folks who are advocating behind closed doors. A lot of times they're dealing with enormous amounts of retaliation themselves. They're psychologically wounded. I see it in all the private chats. Like, I know this bad thing is happening. They're not listening to me. They're alone. They can't talk about it for confidential reasons, and they're suffering. And they haven't been taught in a profession. I wasn't professionally taught either how to manage up in those moments where we don't have leverage. And then there's people like me who had the good fortune of 18-year-old feedback for 7 years. I have a teenager now who gives me feedback, and it's yeah, they don't pull any punches, and then I think working in that diplomatic space with press training and all these things where you're literally murder boarded, and so I had that good fortune literally to say, okay, I can walk into a tough conversation, I can take a punch to the face, I can, you know, manage past that, see past that, and keep us moving forward. And I wish as a profession that was like the standard for everyone. Yeah.
Oh, well, I have so many questions, but I want to get into the meat and potatoes, and I want to know how you got involved so heavily with the workplace abuse.
Yeah. I think that's what started me on this road where I started getting more active on LinkedIn and great podcasts like yours is because I went through it. And for me, it was such an eye-opening experience because when I started my career, I had the good fortune of working with really tough people, people of integrity, and they didn't care if you were an ambassador. They were going to pick up the phone and they were going to call you and they were going to haul you in and they were going to yell at you. And they cared about the rules, they cared about the integrity, they cared about people, and they cared about what was right. And then when I left the State Department, I ended up in environments where that wasn't the case, where there was a lot of abuse of power situations. There was one set of rules for the bottom, and there was a different set of rules for the people who write them. And right off the bat, I was in situations where I was having to go knock on a board member's door or on somebody's door who could fire me and say, "We need to have a conversation. You just did something that was racist. You just did something that was sexist." And then to work through that blowback that was very new for me, and watching how people will choose to punch down at a victim or a complainant because that feels easier and less scary than dealing with the actual problem. And so kind of navigating these lonely spaces where I had to go figure this stuff out. What I realized pretty quickly, though, is as an HR person, I am protected. I'm more protected a lot of times than the complainant. And at the end of the day, I would say, if I look myself in the mirror, what do I stand for? If I'm in this room and I know something's wrong and I don't open my mouth, even as a minority, why am I here? And so I began to have those experiences where I was struggling to advocate for others. And then I left and went to an organization where it directly happened to me, and where I had a chief executive who was an absolute nightmare, someone who had been bullying people for decades. Everyone knew. And here I am, like, I know the law, I know the rules, I know all these things, I know where all the bodies are buried, I know a lot of inside information. I even know a lot of employment attorneys who sue organizations for these things. And so here I am, largely protected, a lot more than other folks, and no one wanted to do a thing. Everyone was too afraid to engage that person, and so the blowback came to me. And I didn't care. I mean, I did care in the sense that I was spectacularly terrified, completely afraid. I felt like my life was in danger. I didn't know how I was going to support my daughter.
Wow.
The timing during the pandemic, I didn't know if I could find another job.
So that recently.
Yeah, and so what happens, I got this deep awareness for the terror that people feel when they're trying to deal with an abusive executive and there's no accountability and everything falls back on the employee. They have to leave their job. They have to explain gaps in employment, why they switch. And so all the negativity kind of sticks with the victim. And so for me, I was definitely alone, but I just kept putting things in writing until I had like a phone book of material. And I kept having to pressure and demand and put in writing saying, anytime a complaint comes to my office, I give them an investigation, a fair, objective, thorough, and timely investigation, which is what the law requires. They didn't want to do it, so the more I put it in writing, they knew that that was discoverable. They finally did it, and the investigation came back and sustained allegations of abuse that said, we can't prove that it was for sexism. We can't prove that it was retaliation because this person really is just mean all the time. In other words, it's illegal. Get over it.
Because that's just how he is.
Yeah. And so, and that's the lawful defense unless you can tie it to protected characteristics or retaliation, then you've got nothing. And it's really grotesque for a number of reasons. One, the injury is still the same. And then two, how you prove intent, of someone is impossible. Like, you're basically asking complaints to be mind readers and then punishing them for not doing it. So the whole thing becomes theater, it becomes a waste of time. And so when I saw this bill come up in Massachusetts that separated that out from protected characteristics, that was documenting the psychosocial implications, like the real injury that happens the PTSD that occurs, brain scans showing scars on our brain from this level of trauma. American Psychological Association rewriting the definition of PTSD to include the workplace because that's how significant that event is. So I had to sign up, I had to go testify. I was the only person doing it from the HR perspective, and I knew that was really important because we are viewed as pro-employer. And so I'm coming at it from the standpoint that protecting the employee is protecting the organization. I am doing my job when I speak out against this stuff. And I'm lucky that I work for a company that also values that and understands that that's important. But we shouldn't have to be left to luck. This should be the standard.
That's true. So it's interesting though, because one of the things that crossed my mind when I was listening to, reading really about this bill, it was, how do you make it objective and not subjective? Because even you were saying it's hard to prove intent, right? So what are we specifically asking for now to be protected?
Yeah, you're right. It absolutely gets very messy. And there's a lot of conversation and debate right now about when do you cross the line. So I can tell you just from my own HR perspective, if I get a call from an employee, if any injury has happened, I follow up. And it's just the safest kind of course of action, whether it's reasonable or not, whether it's a misunderstanding on the complainant's part, like I aim to get to the bottom of it. But like I can tell you, like in my specific case, where someone is screaming at me, telling me that they don't care if I'm breaking the law, I'm going to do what they tell me to do, or my job's on the line. Like there's a clear breach right there. And so acts of intimidation, mobbing, ostracizing, punishing people who raise an issue. And that happens quite frequently, where they may not take away your title, but you can go through years of excellent reviews and all of a sudden you're being ripped to shreds. You're moved into the basement office. The plum assignments are taken away, given to other people. And so you start to see these meaningful impacts on your ability to grow your career. It's now going to hit whether you get promoted, whether you get raises, cost of living adjustments, all these other things. And there's a process where they can begin papering someone on the way out the door for non-performance related reasons.
Gotcha. Okay. So none of those things today are protected then, because if your job is on the line, I feel like that is protected, and there's whistleblower laws, right? That's what came to mind when you said you're protected as the HR person a little bit more even than the victim or complainant or whatever the employee that's making the complaint is called. Is that the whistleblower law? Or
It's a little bit different. It's retaliation. And so if you look at the EEO language, so say you come to me and you're like, look, I've been sexually harassed at work. You are protected from that. Filing that complaint is a protected activity. If I participate in that process in HR, I am also protected. That's a protected activity because I'm doing this in the course of my duties to investigate, to follow up, to try and get to the bottom of stuff and hopefully come to some sort of remedial action. I think where things fall short a lot of the times is in the he said, she said. Like if you look at successful claims around discrimination, a lot of times like the race claim, the sexism claim, it falls apart because the burden of proof is on you as the complainant to say, no, they're doing this because I'm a woman. That can be very hard to prove.
Yes.
Or sometimes it's verbal statements, there's no witnesses, it gets hard to sustain an allegation. But the second you bring a complaint forward, whether you win or not, whether that's sustained or not, retaliation now is at play. And the employer, the burden of proof is on them to try and prove that they didn't retaliate. So the loopholes that are commonly used is they're just mean to everybody. And so therefore, it's not because you're a woman. It's not because you're a person of color. It's just because they're mean. And so therefore, you can't do anything. And so that's the loophole I think we really need to close. And nobody of integrity should be afraid of this. Just don't, if you're not a bully.
Nobody of integrity, but then, there are cases where people will take advantage of situations, I feel like. So,
but they do it now. Like the process is already in place. Somebody can make a race claim, they can make a sexism claim. And there's still like, an objective. You can use outside attorneys, you have inside people that you train. Like that's the function of what HR should be, managing that process in a way that people can trust and
Hmm.
it feels like it has integrity. Because if it's tainted, a good attorney can chew that to pieces. It's just people shouldn't have to go through that process.
Yeah.
But yeah, typically you're right. Like most of the pushback is, oh, there'll be frivolous claims. Then address them. It doesn't mean that they win. It doesn't mean that the second somebody makes a claim, you lose everything.
I think the fear is it'll probably make it easier for them to win on a frivolous claim. I would.
It, yeah, but I think when you look at the lawsuits now,
Hmm.
there's a high bar, and what's been really fascinating since the pandemic is as more people went to remote work, more stuff just ended up in writing. And so
That's true.
a lot of these investigations I found they almost write themselves, because it's just it's no longer, two guys in a warehouse saying something and nobody was around. Those things of course still happen, but it definitely
Yeah.
changed the higher levels. There's usually witnesses to these things.
I recently had a situation. I do work remote most of the time too. And this wasn't, it was work related, but not with someone I work with. It was for a third party.
Mhm.
We're the customer, they're actually the vendor. And it got a little heated. There's been some frustrating brewing, I think, on both sides between us and this particular person. And I don't even think it said that the call was being recorded. It may have, and maybe I just hear it
Yeah.
so much I just ignored it or whatever. The call was recorded, and my boss didn't hear it originally, but he was like, told me, because he ended up talking to that guy's boss, and he was like, the call was recorded. And I was like, can you get a copy of that recording, please? Because I want your opinion. Like, am I in the wrong here? And my boss backed me up 100%, and his boss backed him up 100%. And it's like, how can two people see the same thing completely differently? But anyway, it was just interesting that the different, you know, perspectives, I guess. But at the end of the day, I was like, I'm the customer, so
Yeah.
I hate to throw
Yeah.
I hate to throw that out there, but the bottom line is we're the
Yeah.
customer.
Right.
Be talk to you like that. So anyway.
No, I totally agree. And I think, some of that stuff definitely does help. And, and you do see these like in these, court case, like Tesla comes to mind, really toxic
Oh
culture
yeah.
and just really, really awful. And, that, but, when you have images of a noose outside of someone's locker, people leaving notes, people leaving a lot of evidence on their own, you do still have to have those things. I do stress that to people, like it's so important to document things. It's so important to start creating a story. Because even if you do have a legitimate claim without some type of backup, like what you just had, it's very hard for an investigation process to go really far down a road to the point where you did get that. And part of it is to account for frivolous claims, and part of it
Mhm.
is that process. None of us want to be in something where anyone can just accuse you of something and that's it and you're done. There has to be a fair process.
So in a situation like Tesla, I mean, I think it or now X or whatever
Yeah.
company
Yeah.
Elon Musk owns, I think it's pretty common public knowledge that he is a tyrant, right?
Oh, yeah.
So do you waive any rights if you decide, if you make the choice knowing how he is to go work for somebody like that?
I certainly would, but I also recognize that I have that luxury, and I know that there's plenty of people who may not, and so, um, in an ideal world, we're able to get more information, and it's really fascinating right now because more stuff is beginning to shine a light on that. So I know like Glassdoor is beginning to transition to employee reviews based on gender, ethnicity, and race, because you see that in a lot of climate surveys where a lot of white men are like, no, everything's awesome. And then when they interview women and other categories are like, no, it's not. So
Yeah.
those perspectives, I think, are really important as feedback for everyone in an organization. But then even Gretchen Carlson, who also testified on that after her experience with Fox News,
Right.
she has signed on to start a new type of employee review site that deals with the women's perspective, that deals with sexism. And so things like this, I think, will gain a lot of traction and it will force some hard conversations. inside of an organization to evaluate how they treat people, because there are penalties, like Gen Z in particular. They have a lot of leverage. They know that. They ask very direct questions in interviews. They look at this stuff, and you could lose some amazing talent either by being a jerk or ignoring the jerk in your work site. So it's definitely an important consideration.
So is somebody who is just a jerk, do they just have to suppress that in themselves? I mean, or are we trying to just eliminate them from powers of position? Like, what's the goal? What would be the goal there?
Um, I think for them to stop being a jerk,
Yeah.
I think, one of the things I've been trying to work on more recently is engagement data. It's been pretty murky, but there's a formula that's being tossed around out there that says it's really the high cost of a brilliant jerk. And so these are people who are pretty good at kissing up and kicking down. So to me, what that tells me is you can control it when you want to. You're not yelling at the boss, you're not yelling at a board member. So,
Mm,
it's not impossible, but you are yelling at you wouldn't yell at a client, you wouldn't do these things. And so what we're starting to demonstrate now is, say you have like a salesperson, not to pick on salespeople, but a lot of times they generate a lot of revenue and they can be highly valuable in an organization. And so, say you have this one individual who brings in, say, $1 million a year or whatever that number is, but they have 5 direct reports that they terrorize every day. You can like be confident that they are not giving you 100% at work. You may be lucky if they're giving you 50%. They're either spending their time looking for a new job, trying to heal from being chewed out, calling in sick, all these things that happen that are normal responses. So take all those 5 salaries and cut them in half. You're just throwing that money down the toilet. And that compounds if they also have direct reports that they can't support and be present for. And so these things can ripple around an organization that actually quantify the damage that is being done, on top of the fact that you now have risk of lawsuits. You have risk of Gen Z who will make a video about you. It will go viral. And I've seen people get, lit up with 8 million views in one day and make national news for being a lawful monster and treating their employees bad. So we're in an age of accountability where it no longer makes financial sense to look the other way.
would you be a proponent of or condone somebody making a video like that goes viral?
Yes.
As a,
And
yeah.
part of the reason why is because I have integrity. I believe in this. So, I don't ignore anything. If I hear any problems in my organization, I'm not here just to have the fun conversations or the good news conversations. Like, that's a core part of my job. And so that's feedback I deserve if something happens in my organization. And I absolutely have no discomfort, in speaking to someone who may be above my rank.
Mhm.
Because that's why I'm there. And if I'm there and I know about it and I'm not doing something, I shouldn't be here. So yeah, I actually am comfortable.
To be clear, though, I mean, it shouldn't be their first course of action, right? Like, shouldn't they make the complaint first? And then if those things don't,
Correct. I mean, that would be the ideal scenario. I would
yeah,
much prefer someone to come to me. But I wouldn't own that entirely, but I would own a piece of that, because I do feel like I've walked into situations where the previous AR chief was horrible, ignored everything. And so if you're in a culture of so much fear and unsafety and there's so much around you where it may not be safe,
right.
I put an enormous amount of effort into trying to create that psychological safety for everyone in my organization. And so, I would take it as a bit of feedback.
Right.
I need to do some more work here to assure folks. And I would respond to something like that if it went viral. Like, I would have an open conversation. I would talk about, like, I want to do better about this. I would love for us to get to a
Yeah.
place of this. The risk with some of these things too is sometimes you just don't know. Sometimes there can be actually good explanations for things that happen. There can be legitimate misunderstanding. There can
Mhm.
be so many other threads to that, and you can't always talk about them because we have to protect the confidentiality of the investigation and the people.
Yeah.
But I think, every time that there's a bully and HR is alerted, they don't have to know the details, but if they know that bully is gone, they know that it's a company that lives its values. They know it's a company that listens to people and will protect.
Mhm.
And so I think there are ways to send those signals. And
Mhm.
so in every organization I've been in, I've prided myself on doing that so that that word kind of seeps out into the culture.
Mhm. Yeah, I do understand that a lot of companies don't have someone like you, and it may not be
Yeah.
wise, or maybe they've seen somebody else go
Yep.
through something and they're just know that they have that there's no other
Right.
that
That they'll be
nothing is.
chewed to pieces in the process.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, yeah, there
yeah,
has to
something you can-
be.
So then what are some practical um so here's a scenario,
Mhm.
speaking, asking for a friend. um
Okay. Love it. Yeah.
you are excited to be doing something new, excited to be working for this person, and then almost you're almost being groomed in a
Mhm.
way, being scoped out to make sure you're not the kind of person that's going to talk. And you
Mhm.
want to be a cool person, you want to be fun, and you don't understand what's happening in that moment. It only becomes apparent later down the line when
Yeah.
things are being said and done that you're like, this is completely inappropriate. But now I feel like I've allowed it. I feel like I've participated in it somehow. So there was no thought in my mind to document anything early on. I guess
Yeah.
what's advice for someone in the workplace that you're, because you don't necessarily know right away that you're being
Mhm.
groomed or that that's going to happen. But when you do know, when that realization hits you, what are some things people can do, practical advice for people that can how to document, how to go about it?
Yeah, no. And, it's funny. I've been a magnet for that experience most of my life because I have a Southern accent. And for better or worse, people make certain assumptions about whether I will go along to get along or that, I won't push back, I'll always be polite, or there's like a million things that
Interesting.
I think, yeah, that draw that personality. So I've been in that spot a number of times. And I've also too have had that where I didn't realize till after the fact. I was like, whoa, this is slid off the lanes a little bit.
And you
First thing you
start
do,
having nightmares and dreading going into work. Yeah.
absolutely. And so you always want to protect yourself. Your written record is everything. So as best you can, start going back. Like, what was the first meeting? And a lot of times you can go back through phone messages, you can go back through emails, Zoom meeting invites, all those things will start to push around. And I like to always, whether it's me or somebody I'm trying to protect at the work site, to immediately start a file. The second I see any type of trouble, I might, October 14th at 11:30 a.m. this conversation with X happened, and just the facts, ma'am, state as much as you remember. If you're a little bit fuzzy about the time, you note that. Just say roughly this day, the following week. Try and get as precise as you can, but if you can't, it's okay. But you just want that very clear kind of just the facts, ma'am, write up. And that's for you to help keep yourself organized. And worst case scenario, if you ever have to bring in an attorney or things get really, really bad, or you have to protect yourself from a blow up later on, you have that documentation. By having that documentation too, you're sending signals to management and to HR as well. I mean, there's a huge difference when I get a notice of a complaint and it's someone who's in the throes of emotion, they're understandably wounded and hurt, and they've sent me 30 pages about their feelings. There's a big difference between that and someone who has a very clear timeline, which would feed into an investigation, who cites the rules that have been broken from our own handbook, the law. That will make somebody's hair on the back of their neck stand up a little bit, and they will calculate their response based on that. So, start getting familiar with rules, because it depends on what they're violating. Like if it's clear sexism, if it's clear, just I've had to write those emails of saying, hey, I appreciate you've been working on X, Y, and Z. I've been thinking about this for a while. I like to put it in writing too, because it sends multiple messages. Those become discoverable. They know it becomes discoverable. You're drawing them out in the open. You can still keep a friendly tone. I want to work with you. I want great things for the company. This isn't protecting the company, and I'm really concerned. And you don't even have to do a deep dive. Just saying a few of those words right there you're sending like an encyclopedic volume of information to that person, and they're going to know what it means, and they're going to know the risk and the liability associated with that. And so outwardly, you don't look like you're attacking them or putting them on their heels, but you are, and you're protecting yourself at the same time.
Would you ever recommend talking to the offender?
I think it depends on the situation. Like if I feel like somebody has really bad intent, I go ahead, I go straight for writing. Sometimes I'll go for a verbal before I go for a writing. I think the best outcomes is when you can just move us all forward and get people into a new way of thinking and being. And so I like to try and give the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes people just don't know. Sometimes people are also afraid of something else. So I don't always know. But if I call it to their attention and it keeps happening, then I feel like at that point you have no choice but to do that. And then if something happens in terms of retaliation and you've got that email, and always send that email to your personal account. Always either BCC yourself, always forward it so you have those records and keep that with your timeline. Don't stop evaluating, even if things seem like they're better. Sometimes things come up months later, but those are really good protection. And those are the things that end up in the huge court cases where people didn't act right.
So would you say the majority of the time you have repeat offenders, people who are just kind of awful, or is it more of, oh, I stepped over the line, I apologize, how often do each of those scenarios happen? Or I'm sure there's a continuum of, a spectrum.
There's definitely a mix. I mean, I think one thing that was fascinating in one place where I worked, it was just, it was a good old boy environment. And it was an environment where there were certain men in that community who never received feedback in their entire life. They were influential and, they were just surrounded by a whole community that were like, yeah, everything you say is great. So there's a lot of a strong emotion when some outsider like me comes along and says, no, you're not.
This is not okay.
Yeah, like I'm going to give you some. And so for them, it's painful for a variety of reasons. But I have seen, where I remember one very influential, he broke down and cried. And he was like, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be viewed that way. And it was very sincere. It was, he was just shocked and he had to process some things. And then he would call me constantly. Is this okay to say this? And I want to be that confidant. I want people to feel safe enough to get better. And so for him, a verbal did the job. Like, we got where we needed to go. And I created enough safety for him in that moment, because the best outcome was for him to get it right, for everyone around him to not have to live with something anymore.
He cared. It's not like he didn't care. He just was oblivious.
Exactly. And that happens a lot too, where, you have people who just don't have the lived experience of other folks.
Yeah.
And so they misstep and they have no idea that they've misstepped. And so sometimes it is just bringing it to their attention, or they know it's wrong but they're afraid of somebody else who's blocked them into something. So, psychological safety just has to be everywhere, for folks to come out with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't really just apply to the lower level, under management or lower management or whatever. You're right. It really should apply at every single level. Yeah. Cause you just don't know what people are, what they're dealing with at whatever level they're in.
Yeah. And a lot of times they're very lonely at that level and they want a confidant. They want somebody who they can talk to and know that they won't be blown up. Or a lot of times I've also seen too, where they knew something was off, but they were so afraid to say the wrong thing. Or, there can also be other things like that are very human, very understandable, and they just need some support there. But again, HR can't be afraid to engage above. And if that's happening, then these things can just be left out there.
Right. So you mentioned, obviously that, HR does kind of have a bad reputation. And what would be your wish for, because I feel like kind of almost like you in a way. I mean, you went to school, you were a history teacher.
Yeah.
So, now you ended up in HR. I feel like people end up in HR more often than trained specifically to be in HR.
Absolutely. You're absolutely Right. Yeah.
So, and that probably is part of the issue, right? Because now they're like, oh, I didn't know I was going to have to, you know.
Yeah.
And do they even know how protected they are? I didn't even think about that. But
Yeah.
they maybe they don't even know that they have those protections because they're just not trained formally. So, what would be your ideal for that profession going forward?
I think you kind of articulated it well yourself. It's professional standards, and you're absolutely right. I mean, so many small companies will have like a front desk receptionist who morphs into onboarding and some of these baby things that become HR. I also just think there's a lot of sexism around HR, that it's viewed as a woman's profession, it's viewed as the party planning job, it's not very serious, that anyone can do it. So therefore you have folks come out. There's a lot of these ugly stigmas that are around that. But when I look back, I mean, it was roughly 100 years ago where lawyers kind of went through their own internal process. And some of it was just a bad reputation around corruption, not doing things right, not being ethical. But they went through a very deliberate kind of movement to set up like an American Bar Association or all these state organizations where they monitor their own, there's ethical standards, they can hold their own accountable. I would love to see something like that. I would love to see SHRM not just talk about, how to manage the bottom down, but really dive much deeper into how to manage up and how to know that those things are there and to make it accessible because SHRM can be expensive for like a teeny tiny company that can't invest in that for someone who morphs into
What
that.
is that you're saying? Sure.
So, like the Society of Human Resources Management, like some of these
Okay.
national, organizations that usually kind of lead the charge on that. But I have found with so much stuff on abuse in the workplace, there's all these trainings for the employees. But if the CEO says, no, I don't want to do that, what do? You can't make them, and that happens in a lot of areas. Or they do the training and they ignore it, and you just send a worse message to everyone. So there has to be a deliberate focus on the top of an organization and HR's role in that organization. I also heard somebody talk about, which was really fascinating, that you have a mechanism where HR doesn't report to the CFO or CEO, that they report to some outside organization. And so kind of the ways that you might have like around law enforcement or, some of these other things where there's some type of national accountability that holds them accountable, which therefore holds companies accountable. That one feels like that one might be a bigger lift, but there's something to kind of be said for that. But I also think we don't have to wait. Like I talk openly about the backdoor conversations in HR because I want to. I think nobody else is talking about this. And I think if you act with integrity, you have nothing to hide. And so all these folks in HR who are sitting home right now, who are in enormous pain because they are in these environments where they can't talk to anyone, that they believe they can't talk to anyone, they can remove the descriptors, they can come out, they don't have to name names, they can talk about their experience. The fear that holds them back is if they come out and say, oh, I had a nightmare chief executive, or I broke confidences and I'm talking publicly about abuse, then no one will hire them again. And I'm here to say that's false. I've been doing that for a year now. And I get so many messages on LinkedIn from CEOs saying, this happened to me. Thank you for talking about this. It hasn't made me a pariah. It hasn't made me like, oh, I don't want to hire this lady. I think in a lot of respects.
That?
Huh?
Did you fear that when you started out?
I did. I feared like, what is the consequence? And I had to have a very open conversation with my CEO saying like, I want to talk about this. And I was lucky, he was like, okay, because he's not afraid either. But then, when you look at the statistics, I mean, I think it was like 60% of American workers have either witnessed discrimination at the work site or experienced it. 50 million have been abused, whether that's tied to protected characteristics or not. I mean, the overwhelming majority of us have been through the ringer at some point or another, and it's not great. The majority don't like being abused at work, and like it shouldn't be a crazy radical thing to say.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
But yeah, there's a lot of people who get like, oh, because you're stepping into an arena where you may ruffle some powerful feathers, and so it does make people uncomfortable. But I think we need to push through that.
Yeah, it makes me very uncomfortable. I was just thinking, like, if I was pretty young when I was in the situation, I mean, my friend, when she was in that situation,
It's
um,
okay.
and I guess in a way I lucked out. I never had to address it. I don't know that I even understood the full, like, what was really happening until much later in life. Maybe when the Me Too thing became big, that I looked back and went, yeah, me too. Like, me too. It was, and I've found out, because I've been vocal with people who also knew this person, and some of them are like, oh yeah, that guy was a creep. And some of them are like, what? Are you serious? Like, I had no idea. They believed me though. Nobody didn't believe me, which I was thankful for. But circumstances happened where he left the company, I remained, and not because of anything bad happening, but I knew his children, I knew his wife. Like, it would have been so awkward. I don't know that even now, if I were in that situation, if I would be strong or brave enough to even bring it up. I really don't. And that's sad.
But it's legitimately hard, and I don't question anyone that feels that fear. I mean, there was really amazing testimony in Boston, and I remember one man speaking particularly about the impact on single moms. They suffer the worst with this stuff because they're just more vulnerable. They've got young mouths to feed. The rent is past due. Like, they're literally trapped in a lot of ways, which I feel like this is why it's so important that people who are safe say something, because, I wanted to be there. I wanted to go up there and do that, because I knew that there were millions of people who couldn't. And so
Yeah.
anyone who can put it in writing, because
I found out later I had witnesses, like, people
oh, really?
saw what was going on. And
Yeah.
never said a word to me until I brought it up. And then they were like, oh yeah, I saw. And little did I know, I could have maybe called on those people to help me out if I had decided to do something at that time. But I didn't know. I had no idea. How would I know?
Well, not only that, but sometimes, and it's sad to say, what'll happen is people are witnesses. They'll tell you that they know, but they're terrified to go on the record.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah,
so that's why I always say start writing it down,
right.
put it
Don't
in there.
rely on them. Yeah.
Yeah. And let that your story compound and build up, because a lot of times it comes down to a credibility finding, and an investigator, and I've worked with plenty of good investigators. I actually trust investigators way more than I trust companies, because I've seen plenty of investigations come back and say, I think that person's lying because there was enough on this side, and they look at motivation. Like, why would a terrified person jeopardize their career and their social standing? And a lot of times complainants are scared out of their mind of retaliation, and then they weigh that in there. Unfortunately, what can happen is they'll come back and say that person's guilty, and then the company will take the least amount of action possible, because they don't want to assume any liability. And they'll do everything they can to keep that report under attorney-client privilege so that it's protected, it can't get out.
Right. Yeah, there were a lot of factors at play. This person was not necessarily a high executive, but the literally systems relied 100% on him. It was a really bad position for the company to be in, honestly. And
Yeah, a
that's
highly valued employee.
yeah, like, if he were to quit or walk away, or like, literally would have been detrimental to the company. So he would have been very much protected, I think, even if they didn't want to.
Yeah, it happens over and over and over again, and that's why I talk a lot about executive abuse specifically,
Mhm.
because there's still this lingering carve out for a certain class of employees, and and I talk to CEOs who acknowledge that, and so we need to start being proactive. We need to start building in redundancies. We need to make sure
Mhm.
it's not a single point of failure, so that you're not losing everyone else, and that you're not creating, because there can be long-term implications,
Yeah.
for sure, that. And if that person's abusing other folks, they're only that type of environment. If you're seeing them respond negatively, that doesn't go away on its own. It only goes away if someone holds them accountable at some point.
Right. Yeah. Well, thankfully he's retired now and hopefully not terrorizing anyone else.
Yeah, or didn't raise any children to follow in his behavior.
Like,
Yeah. Oh my.
yeah. But when you know their family too,
Yeah.
and you like their family, and it's hard. That's hard because that will affect not just that person, but the family. And then I don't know, it would have been, it's weird for me to even talk about it right now on this podcast where,
Yeah.
I'm not naming names, but people could figure it out.
Mhm. But I also think, I mean, for me, the way I look at it too is there's also the families of the people he hurt, and the
Yeah.
folks come home twisted up in knots, not able to sleep, can't pay attention to their kids because they're, swimming in stress. And yeah.
So, is there any other advice or any other thing you want to talk about before we close? Do you want to talk a little bit more about this psychological abuse bill that you're advocating for?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think maybe two closing points is the Workplace Psychological Safety Act is, so we just went to the House in Boston, and we're hoping that that's going to move through to the Senate. It would become the first bill in the country that really addresses bullying. And it's not just Massachusetts. So we're expecting to see a bill number in New York City. This same bill has already passed in the Senate in Rhode Island, so they will debate it in the House early next year. I am working with some folks to present this in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. Even my young daughter, who's doing legislative training with the mayor's office, is looking to present this bill to the mayor's youth council. I've sent this to assembly members in New York. I've sent this to state senators in California, where my company is and where I used to live. So there's so many ways people can get involved. You can sign a petition, you can send this to your representative saying, I want this in my state. And I know similar bills are going to like Ohio, West Virginia. I think this is something that's going to catch fire in the next year. And I think once one state is first, there'll be pressure on about a dozen or other so states to also want to do this. I see a lot of that language like New York, we're the first to have the most progressive bill on women's rights, and California loves to be first on employee rights, and Colorado and all these places. And that's just an enormous win for folks everywhere. And even if you're in a state that may not be a champion of employee rights, if you work for a remote company or a large company that has headquartered in some of these states, a lot of these bills are writing language that covers people in other parts of the US if they work to the benefit of an employer in a state where this is the law. So we're talking about changing the lives of millions of people. Like, to me, it is so consequential. This is like Gilded Age stuff we haven't seen in 100 years. Like, this is really, really powerful in terms of protecting people. So definitely would love for folks to check out that website, submit written testimony. Even if you don't want to write a lot, just a few sentences saying, I care about this can go a long way. And then for anyone who is going through this pain themselves, I write a lot on LinkedIn, and I have a framework called the Fear Not framework that kind of goes through the process of how to prep a case, how to document it, how to articulate your case, how to understand the rules. So when you're in the early stages of that nightmare situation, how to begin to protect yourself, how to begin to alert the company in a way that can be safe if there's an issue. And then in the worst case scenario, how to find an attorney to go after your own high dollar claim because you've built up that record to really solidify what has happened and document what has happened to you.
That is awesome. That is fantastic. And the website, just to put it out there, Workplace Psychological Safety Act.org. I'll put that in the show notes and I'll put it on the screen.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
That's a mouthful. Workplace Psychological Safety Act.org. Got it.
Yeah, definitely. And
probably as I was listening to it, I'm like, oh, this would be so cool if I could clip this and include it in the podcast, but I don't know if I'm allowed. Am I allowed to do that?
Yeah. So it's all public record. So
okay, good.
Everybody that spoke, that was a public hearing and it's publicly available. So.
Awesome. I will definitely take clips from that and include it at the beginning and the end.
Awesome. That's great. I appreciate it. Yeah. So
well thank you so much. Yeah. Where are you now?
I'm in Washington, D.C., so
You
I'm
are in
back.
DC. Okay.
Yeah, it's a cold, rainy day, which is perfect. I hated being sick when it was 70 outside. That really hurt. I'm glad it's not nice.
I'm in Colorado. So
Oh,
yeah, I'm about to go watch the eclipse.
that's right. I'm so jealous. Okay, we'll keep you. I hope you're.
Looking, I don't know if it's because of the eclipse. Oh, it's bright and sunshiny. Yeah, okay. I just have the blinds closed because this time of day the sun would be like right in
Morning sun.
here.
Yeah, we don't have that today here.
Yeah, but I've got my glasses. I'm ready to go.
Awesome. Well, that's really neat. I'm glad you're getting to experience that.
Yeah, me too. I kind of missed the other one. I was working and not in a place where you could see it very well back in 17, but so yeah, I'm
Yeah.
excited about it. But thank you so much. And yeah, I'll keep you posted on when everything gets published and appreciate you taking
Yeah.
time out of your Saturday morning.
You too. So thank you. It's glad to be here.
Okay, have a good one.
You too.
At one point in time in our U.S. history, there was a voice that stood up for spousal abuse, for child abuse, for domestic violence.
Abusive culture created over time by the choices that the organization makes, who to promote, what policies are created and enforced, and how the company handles reports of abuse.
What happens is when the can gets kicked down the road enough, the extreme circumstances become the norm.
It's a known fact that bullies love to attack top performers, arguably one of a company's greatest resources.
They trigger bullies who fear being viewed in comparison as incompetent frauds.
In 2008, toxic workplaces cost organizations $16 billion in related healthcare costs, or almost $23 billion today.
Visit workplacepsychologicalsafetyact.org to get involved. The deadline in Massachusetts is February 2024 to move this bill forward. You can sign a petition at endworkplaceabuse.com, and you can find Kimberly and her Fear Not framework on LinkedIn /Kimberly-E-Williams, where she talks extensively about workplace abuse and advocates for change. Thank you so much, Kimberly.